Welcome, everyone, to this time of learning and conversation. Thank you for joining us. Part of fulfilling today's scripture is being able to see Christ in every person. And part of developing that ability is to look within to understand our own biases and how to deal with them effectively so we can build relationships with our neighbors. We're happy today to welcome Molly and Jihoon to be with us today and lead us in conversations to help us live into our calling as a Matthew 25 presbytery. Molly Castile is the manager for equity and representation in the PCUSA Office of the General Assembly, and Jihoon Oh is the director of Mid-Council Ministries in the PCUSA Office of the General Assembly. Welcome to you both.
Thank you, Mike. As you just heard, my name is Jihoon Oh. I serve in the Office of the General Assembly, and Molly and I are so happy to be here with you this afternoon to talk about the ways in which implicit bias can affect the ways that we build relationship and how we might find some ways to stop and to reflect and bring to awareness some of those biases that we carry that impact our relationships so that we can participate with God in building the sort of reign of God on earth that really lives into the love and justice of God for all of us and as a human community. And so with that quick introduction, I'll just give you a little bit of an overview of what we hope to accomplish in this time. We have about 90 minutes that is split evenly into times where Molly and I will introduce you to some concepts and talk a little bit about some of the ideas and the ways some framework to think about how we actually talk about implicit bias, why it's important to think about implicit bias, and what some of the ways that we might be able to approach that would be. And to talk also about a story where we think that implicit bias and some of those automatic associations show up, which is the parable of the Good Samaritan, hopefully a story that most of you are, or many of you are really familiar with, and for us to be able to really dig into some of that story. And then we'll sort of have that in breakout rooms where we'll ask you to discuss in groups of 5 or 6 to talk about the story, talk about the things that you're noticing, the interplay between the ideas that we'll present and the Bible story itself. And we hope that we'll get to have you do some practice of some of the concepts so that the presbytery can continue to talk about ways to really, again, build vital communities and to really think about ways to build a more inclusive community wherever you are located as a way of showing our discipleship to Christ. And so with that, I'm going to go ahead and pass things over to Molly Castile to introduce herself and to get us going with the rest of the time this afternoon.
Hello, all. It's a joy to be with you and with Jihoon to do this workshop, which we really enjoy. Excuse me. We asked you to do some preparatory work. And so I want to remind you of what the implicit bias definition is that Kirwan Institute uses. I hope you really enjoyed some of the modules that you experienced there, and I hope you might explore more of the content there. Implicit bias is a relatively unconscious or automatic association towards a group which may be in direct conflict with one's explicit beliefs and values. So these are the fast impression, fast associations that your brain makes. And they do not have to align with what you think about a group or what you believe about a group. You can absorb all sorts of positive and negative associations from the cultures, from your families, from the communities, from media, from all sorts of influences. Those automatic assumptions help your brain do things very quickly. But implicit bias is that automatic short. We hopefully that's a reminder of the content, because you've spent some time in those modules with the Kerwin Institute. And so we're going to leap right into our first experience together. So what we are asking you to do, we're going to send you to breakouts for 10 minutes. We're asking you to read the Luke 10 verses 25 through 37, which is the Good Samaritan story. And as you read the passage together, identify some places in the story where automatic associations or assumptions are operating. Hopefully that is clear as mud, but I ask our tech friends to send us into breakout rooms now for 10 minutes. So you will get a countdown when the breakout room is going to close. Please take care to have everyone participate. If you are a person who typically fills up empty space, hold yourself back and make space for others. And if you typically step back and let others kind of take up space, I encourage you to challenge yourself to step forward a little bit. All of that is to say, please enjoy a conversation about the Good Samaritan with one another.
Well, welcome back, everyone. I hope you had a good discussion and a reading of the story. So as we continue our work, we want to take a moment to actually do a little bit of a body check. As we continue to talk about things like implicit bias and things of, and as we go deeper into this work, it'll be really good for us to be aware of our bodies, where we might be feeling some stress or anxiety, where we might be feeling some discomfort. Sometimes our brains don't actually know that we're feeling that way, but our bodies do. And so just take a moment to sit back, and whether it's to close your eyes really briefly or to set your gaze softly in another direction away from your screen, just take an inventory of your body from the top of your head to your toes, just to check with yourself about whether there are places where you're feeling some tension. As we're continuing to talk about this and continue to dive into the topic of implicit bias and the ways in which we actually build relationships, whether there was something about the story that raised some discomfort for you, where you might be feeling some of that. Sometimes a lot of folks will talk about holding a lot of stress in their stomach area. For some folks, it's in that shoulder region, in the neck, where we feel stiffness or a sense of discomfort and tightening. Those sorts of things are really important for us to do some checking, because our bodies will sometimes signal to us that our emotions are at play in a way that our brains are not able to pick up. And so we'll do another, check or two as we continue this conversation. Just wanted us to have a time to do that. So I'll just give an additional 30 seconds for us to do a little bit of a scan of our bodies and sort of ground ourselves back again. And as Molly's put into the chat, a deep breath or two is a way for us to help enter a space anew. It's a way for us to reset our bodies, because sometimes it's really important to interrupt the responses that our body takes on. So much of the implicit bias pieces are really hardwired into our brains, so that we may actually survive. This was the way that our bodies were designed. And so often things that make us feel like we're in danger or anxious will actually create in us a fight or flight response, or a freeze response, or a fawn response. Any of those things are possible responses that our brains will take on so that we can survive and keep ourselves safe. And so the brain is actually processing so much information all the time. And in fact, there's, even though it's good to have snacks, right, while you're having meetings, there's some reason for that, right? That these snacks, sort of sugary things or whatever, feed our brain and feed our body so that our brains can actually have the energy it needs to sustain itself over a lot of the processing. And so the brain is really a drain on the body's resources, and it actually does take up a lot of energy processing lots and lots of information constantly. The part of the brain that actually consciously processes information is really small and is only able to do a small number of bits per information. So take a look at what you're seeing now on the screen, that the brain is processing 11 million bits of information per second unconsciously, while the conscious pieces of information that we're processing is about 45 bits per second. So 11 million versus 45 bits of unconscious to conscious. So most of the things that our brains are processing are unconscious. And again, that's so that we don't have to spend so much energy trying to figure out, is this a dangerous situation? Is this going to put me at risk? Is this a safe person? Is this person part of my family? Can I trust them, etc.? In addition to all the other things that our body needs to be processing in order to survive, things like breathing and walking and having balance. And so all of these things are pre-programmed into our bodies through our culture or our society, our families. And so things that are beliefs, our feelings, our categories of how we actually sort of decide who's safe and who's not, and what situations are safe and what is not. Things that are those sorts of things are being constantly processed in the background. And so often these unconscious biases, these implicit biases, these prejudices are often then handed out, and they're set as expectations, they're set as limits on understanding and creativity. And so it really is then that we can actually see things that are not really there, hear things that are not really there. We can think that we're picking up on things with our senses, but it may actually be being impacted by the things that are already programmed into our brain. And so again, being able to interrupt some of those processes and to think about stories that we know, to actually interrupt those narratives, to interrupt our automatic associations, is a really important process that we can take on in order to build better relationship. So we're just a quick reminder for folks to mute if you are not muted. Just to do another check of your system. But the question really then, as we're thinking about the Good Samaritan story again, is we are usually reminded or asked when we're reading the story about who the neighbor is. Because that's the story that's in this, that's the question that's in the story. That's the question that Jesus is dealing with. But we'd like to ask a different question, which is, who is the other in the story? Who's being assumed as the other? Who's being assumed as neighbor? Who is being assumed that they should be the good people who should be helping? And who's being seen as the threat that ends up actually being the person who steps into place to actually care for the needs of the person who's there? And so those questions that are the sort of corollaries, or the sort of the parallel questions to the ones that are being asked, I think are often really important. And so again, the in the story, the Samaritan is the one who's actually being assumed as the other, but actually acts in a neighborly way. That the people who are assumed, and by the listeners of the story or the hearers of the parable, who would be friends, who would be neighbors, who would be safe people, the priest, the lawyer, the teacher, the people who would be assumed to be the ones who would do God's will or to be the good people in the story, are actually being sort of shown as the folks who are skirting around. There also is making some assumptions about who's on the side of the road. There are all sorts of things that are happening, and I imagine a lot of this came up in your discussions. But a lot of it can also then be fit into another framework called othering and belonging. And so I'm going to pass it on to Molly to talk a little bit about that.
What we'd like to offer you is a framework that comes out of the Othering and Belonging Institute in California, John Powell's work. So if you have, you may have some reading groups that are taking on some anti-racism books, etc. Racing to Justice is one of the books that John Powell has written that is quite good. This understanding of kind of the habits and the ways of being, the behaviors and the attitudes and the beliefs that frame the ways in which we engage one another. This institute has renamed itself to frame it into this larger othering and belonging. Social science would tell us that all human beings need a place, a sense of people group of belonging, that belonging is one of those fundamental needs that we have. But the reality in our social circumstances is that we don't offer everyone belonging. We define ourselves often in relationship with who we are in community with and who we are not. So I'm going to offer you this frame of othering and belonging and kind of give you a few examples. So in othering, there is an us and a them. The other is, othering is a verb. So in order to be us, there needs to be a them to them. Right? So I'm using verbs and nouns interchangeably, and I'm making nouns do verb work. And so I want to recognize that can be a little confusing. But I bet that all persons gathered today have had the experience of being othered, have had the experience of getting a sense that one of these things or people aren't like the others, right? This way in which we either non-verbally or verbally give signals to persons or visitors that they are a part of the group or not a part of the group. But that us versus that impulse, that move to othering is a impulse or move that creates division. It creates enemies. It creates polarization. It creates in-groups and out-groups. And so we're asking you to kind of sit with that little move that happens both in our heads and in our bodies. Those implicit associations have automatic behaviors. There are ways in which we signal to one another that you are not one of us. So othering is a concept, a framework that's driven by comparison and competition. There's winners and losers. The self is the system. So folks in othering will say that everyone who belongs is like me. Now that can be really explicit, or that can be less so. So that to belong here, you must assimilate to behave like me, or to be to wear the right things, or to say the right things. So the self is centered, and I am the ideal of the group. There's hierarchy, there's power, and there's high individualism in the othering section. And there's so the behaviors in the othering kind of worldview are breaking behaviors. These are behaviors that disconnect the them from the us, and it causes harm to all parties. So it enhances distinctions and it separates me from the other. And the other can be a lot of different categories. So this is not all race. This is not all gender. It's not all right. But these are the kinds of ways in which our brain creates a kind of us and them. Set beside that is this framework and worldview and understanding of belonging. And often when we are reading Bible, or we're thinking theologically, or we're considering what the church is aspiring to be, we often speak in terms that indicate that belonging is really critical. So we talk about being one family or one body and many parts. The vine and the branches, right? That there's this unity, this connection, this sense. Now, in any of those images, all of the parts are not the same in belonging, right? They're different parts, but they belong to the same we. And so instead of us versus them in belonging, it's building a bigger we. It's a group focus. It's there's individuality, but it does not disrupt the connections among the individuals. Persons in belonging are vigilant for connection and empathy. So there's a lot of grace and a lot of space given in a belonging kind of mindset. The self is in a system that is larger, and the me is among many me's, and those me's are not like me, right? So it's we is a bunch of me's. There's solidarity in the belonging understanding. So this is I'm a self, but I'm in a larger context. I'm not alone, which sometimes the othering can get to a space where we become very isolated. And then bridging behaviors would be the enlarging our connections and our understandings. So I'm going to now focus on those behaviors. So every one of us has experiences of being othered, and every one of us has experiences of othering. And hopefully every one of us has experiences of belonging and of extending that belonging to others. So bridging, breaking, and bonding are the behaviors that support either othering or belonging. It's how we relate. They can be automatic behaviors. I hope that links up to the associations, because those thoughts are also linked to behaviors. There are things that we do automatically. It's that way in which we connect to our brains know things, but that unconscious level that Jihan talked about, that 11 million bits, knows a whole lot more. And that knowledge is information coming from your full body. So there are things that one does with that whole body that are automatic behaviors or automatic actions that give a sense. They can create a bridging, a breaking, or a bonding behavior with people you encounter without you speaking. So part of interrupting biases is also kind of becoming more intentional in our behaviors and trying to make conscious what is unconscious. So breaking behaviors are everywhere. They are, especially in American culture, where competition, survival of the fittest, rigid, high individualism, you could come up with 1,001 examples of breaking behavior. Anything that's in the political realm is going to encourage breaking behavior. The identity formation by defining ourselves against who we are against or who we are not with is part of that piece. So pulling away from other groups in ways that make it easier to tell and really believe false stories. So when we isolate ourselves into smaller groups, we start telling ourselves stories that we haven't checked with people outside of our group. So it makes sense that when we double down, we've got that kind of going. Okay, first of all, let me just do a little body check. Everybody breathe. Big breath. Let's just pause. Right? This is one of those, because as we give you content, we're also going to be triggering those automatic responses, and our bodies are going to start feeling out of sorts a bit, whether that's a tension or a distraction or a sense of, hey, maybe I don't need to be here, right? So breaking behaviors, they can manufacture or manipulate. They can structure, they can create an other that helps the group form itself, but it forms itself against something. Bridging behaviors are relating to other groups based on deep listening, empathetic space, and recognition of suffering. Being seen, being acknowledged, being understood, these are bridging behaviors. It rejects that there's a them while recognizing our unique differences. In the Book of Order, we talk about unity and diversity. We don't say unity and sameness. We say unity and diversity. Everyone is coming in their uniqueness. And a strategic or intentional response to reject othering. So in some ways, bridging can be harder. It may not be automatic, but it is in itself. To switch to bridging behavior is an intervention, is a disruption into that automatic bias frame. And then the role of stories and cultural narratives in bridging and breaking. So shared humanity, optimism, opportunity, inclusion can counteract those other stories that we may not even bring to our voice because they're unattractive or they're outside of what we say we're going to be when we're together. But the reality is the fear and kind of that angry populism that it's important to keep our stuff away from them, right? That kind of stuff. Has grown out. Those widespread breaking stories create kind of a dark and scary future. When you look at movies these days, how many movies have a dystopian kind of frame where you're invited into this ragtag group of revolutionaries that are going to save the world against this terrible whatever it is, right? Like the prevalence of those kinds of stories, both on our news and in our movies and television, tells you that we're in a time of tumult and a time of disruption where breaking behaviors are so common. It's very easy to fall into those pieces. I now get the pleasure of sending you back to breakout rooms. Now, I want you to hold some of this bridging, breaking, and bonding, this othering and belonging framework, and we're going to go back to our story. So here is your task. We're asking you, what are the stories where you have been the wounded person? This is a time when you get to determine how you share and what you share. Choose where your needs are today. Again, check in with your body. If just the idea of sharing wounds pulls you into a place where your body is getting resistant and rigid, choose a less scary story to share. But we ask that you do find a way to share a story where you've been the wounded person. When have your wounds, your needs, your cries been ignored? When is someone in your community ignoring and not noting your injuries or your needs? A time when someone devastated you and then left. That is your ask. We're going to give you 5 minutes because we think that this is an easy question to get to. Where have you been othered?
So I know that in our small breakout room, we had some good sharing of shorthanded, short versions of our story. And we ran out of time a little bit at the end. But we hope that what this will mean is that you all will continue sharing these stories with one another as you continue using this framework so that you continue thinking about how this framework might really push us to think about how we are sometimes in the role of all the various roles and actually continuing to engage in breaking, bonding, bridging behavior, so often because of the automatic associations that our brains are making. I want us to take another deep breath before we actually head into our second breakout. So this is a series of 3 breakouts that we're going to be going in and out of really rapidly, but we're doing that so that we can actually have a stop to the sort of first sharing and then go and talk about a different prompt. And so hopefully that you'll be able to make that transition. We'll just take another breath to reset before we head into our second breakout. And the prompt for this one is, what are the stories where you've been the lawyer, the teacher, or the priest? And so this is really asking us to think about encounters where we have engaged in behavior that might be breaking, of seeking distance, of actually pulling away from those who are in need, as the slide about breaking behavior that Molly presented has been about. So we'll go back into a breakout room, 5 minutes again, for this particular question. What are the stories where you've been the lawyer or the teacher or the priest?
So hopefully the conversation progressed there as we kind of spend some time in the story thinking about where the othering and belonging framework and where our implicit associations are influencing behaviors that are bridging or breaking. We're gonna some of you have probably anticipated what the next move is, but the next move is good. We're gonna give you more time because the reality is that as human beings, we're in all these locations in this story. And so now we're going to ask you to spend 10 minutes in your next group contemplating this question. And we're going to ask you, instead of stories from all of your life, where folks might have been reaching way back machine to tell stories about their experiences, we're asking you to pull that story into something in the last 2 weeks. Where have you been the perpetrator that has caused the harm? When have you been the breaker or the otherer? And in this story, where have you been the robber? So 10 minutes. Cite what you need to, do your own kind of safety planning and think about what you want to share and how. But I would also ask you, as you kind of enter your new group, breathe. Pause and give yourself some space. Notice what your body is telling you about your reactions to the stories you're thinking about, and use that as also wisdom as you consider what you share with one another. But what is an encounter in the last 2 weeks in which you have been the robber? very likely that you became more aware of your body as the questions piled up, as we asked you to return to the story with a different angle. It's very likely you felt an accelerated pulse, or shallower breath, or more animated in your voice and mannerisms, or some space of that's perfectly normal. And hopefully you're checking it, as you're scanning both your intellectual choices to these questions, you are also kind of connecting your body and your brain a little bit more in kind of what's happening and how you're feeling. I'm trying to advance a slide and talk at the same time. Look at me trying to do two things at once. So I'm going to ask you one of the real critical things, right? When Jihan talked about the kind of mechanics of the brain, that the unconscious mind is processing 11 million bits of information per second, and the conscious mind can do 45 bits per second. It's very clear that, and a lot of that unconscious stuff is staying upright, breathing, there's many systems, all the sensations, where is my head in space, am I balanced, all those things. And any little bit of disorder in those kinds of systems can create incapacities, right? And yet, one of the primary ways that we can interrupt those automatic associations that turn into automatic behaviors, that without our brains agreeing that we want to do that othering behavior, but we start behaving in that signaling, we're clutching our purse when a young person is present, or we're locking the doors on our car when we go to, all those kinds of things are automatic associations and behaviors. So one of the first skills we're going to ask you to do, and this is the beginning of a conversation, is that literally slowing down to notice your body reactions, the places in which your body is making a decision about what is happening and what your reaction is, and before your brain is pulling that into a conscious thought. Every second, every minute, every hour, every day, you have opportunities to bring into your conscious awareness what exactly is happening in the moment. And if you pause and slow down, you have the opportunity to consider alternatives. And all of those tasks, that taking a deep breath, reconnecting to your body and checking in with what you're thinking and feeling. Where are the sensations in your body that are giving you signals of whether your automatic set, that downloaded software that says these things are safe and these things are not safe, and all those kinds of narratives that you've absorbed from your communities, from your families, from your cultures, from the wider society. Slowing down and pausing is one of the first critical skills. So we're going to offer you this word, choice point, which is an attempt to kind of name those moments and claim the power and authority and influence that you have to make adjustments in what would be an automatic behavior and exchange it with something that might turn toward bridging or be more open to the bigger we. So a choice point is where if you do the same old choices and actions, you're going to get the same old outcome, which may be inequity, exclusion, separation, isms, or that kind of breaking behavior that builds the hierarchy, reinforces the hierarchies, reinforces the separations and divisions. And we're asking you to consider when you flex to a new alternate, that you try to choose equitable options. Equity is a term. It is not equality. It is a recognition that there are differential impacts, that folks enter the conversation at different spaces, and there are gaps, and there are inequities, are injustices, wealth gap, the pay gap, etc. These are places where resources are allocated differently to different because of group membership or because of identity. So choosing a more equitable option is leaning into that gap and choosing to address the concern. So belonging where you're intentionally reaching across an othering chasm is an example. And that new outcome, then there are outcomes that become available to you for that new behavior because you're shifting what you do and you influence those around you. So here are some examples of choice points that folks are identifying where they can have a more equitable outcome. So these can be, you may choose to go to a retail store because of the positions that the retail store takes and the ways in which they invest their money or the ways in which they engage the community. If this frequently happens when a retail store chooses to participate in a community ministry in a really big way. Sometimes congregation members will choose to spend their money with that retail establishment because that retail establishment is participating in building a bigger we in the community, in a ministry that matters. How do you use your volunteer time? Where do you invest your times and talents? What organizations do you support? So there's personal choice points, and then there's institutional choice points. So as congregations, what are you prioritizing in your kind of ministry plans? What budget? Budgets can be moral documents. So where are you investing your moral intentions into? Routines, habits, etc. Jihan.
Yes, I'm back. My internet is back. So thank you, Molly, for carrying on. And one of the comments that Molly and I sometimes get as we talk about kingdom building and implicit bias and equity work, and as we continue to engage in our work with intercultural competence around the denomination, frequently we're asked about what is the foundation for this work other than it's just a good thing to do. And we find that there's a lot of foundation in the Bible, in our theological lens that is based on the Bible within the Presbyterian Church USA. And so you see on the screen a few of those examples, both from the Old Testament and the New Testament, about God's call to the people of Israel to welcome aliens among them, to create a bigger we, instead of treating the aliens as outcasts, to actually treat them as you remember wishing you would be treated, as strangers living in a strange land. Of the Samaritan woman being connecting and bridging with Jesus around worshiping God, and then going out to be a witness to tell the good news of a man who knows everything she's ever done. And by telling that story with folks who had breaking behavior with her beforehand, creating a bigger we, and is sort of imagining that space for her. Of Paul being at the Areopagus and seeing strange religious habits and a statue to an unknown God, and creating that bridging moment to say, we are worshiping together, and I would love to share with you this name of an unknown God that I call by a particular name. Deacons who were charged with caring for a bigger we by being sent out to care for widows of a community that was not part of the original we that got created. And again, the story of the Good Samaritan, right, that calls us to imagine how, not just to ask who are the neighbors, who are the us that we should be helping, but thinking about ways that we might draw the we bigger and be the neighbor that we actually wish others would be towards us. And so all of these pieces within the Bible as great examples, and that call that God has placed on all of our lives to continue creating inclusion and equity within God's kingdom. And also, of course, in the Book of Order talks about unity and diversity that Molly talked about before, that just because we have unity doesn't mean that we have to all be the same, but that we actually bring this uniqueness that creates this beautiful picture that is more than the parts when they're separated, and that we is what creates that. The openness that we are to have towards one another, and that curiosity that I think is a result of that again sort of creates more spaciousness for who is included in that we. And there's so many more there that we could talk about, but wanted to sort of highlight that this is, I mean, you all know this, I'm not saying anything new to you, right? But this is this issue of really thinking about how we create a bigger we is really a matter of discipleship to Jesus Christ. And it's really an invitation, not just to awareness, but deeper reflection. Because I think sometimes it's really easy for us to say, oh, I should do better because that's a good thing to do, and because this is a way of loving one another, and to sort of spread that love. And that's absolutely right. But I think the piece that we are highlighting in terms of why we're actually presenting this implicit bias alongside of this breaking and bridging behavior is an invitation to wonder, what is causing us to actually engage in those breaking and bridging behavior? Besides just convenience, are there assumptions that we hold? Are there automatic associations that we have? Are there things that we assume we know about other people instead of holding on to that curiosity and openness that's causing us to actually take shortcuts in our answers and our behavior? And how can we reflect on those so that we can interrupt and make different choices? And so the last breakout group that we're going to ask you to do, Craig, we're going to switch the timing on this. We had originally planned for 15 minutes, but we're going to shorten that to 10 in the interest of time. Just looking at we want to recognize that folks are beginning to have other things butting up against this time. And so the last breakout session is for 10 minutes to, again, choose a viewpoint, whether that's the robber, the lawyer, the priest, or the teacher, and think about where are the places to pause and what are the available choices, holding together the idea of the choice points and the implicit bias and the automatic associations. Where are the places where we might pause in that story as one of those characters that we've asked you to identify? And what are the available choices that might have been made in that moment as a way of practicing choice points within the story that we've been exploring? So please send us into our breakout rooms for 10 minutes. Well, I hope that as we're coming back, that your discussions in your breakout rooms were as rich as the discussion in the room where I was. As we head to wrapping up, Molly's going to give us some instructions while I set up the screen. So Molly, go ahead and let us know what we're doing for the end.
Unmute myself before I could do that. So we're going to try something highly interactive in Zoom, and that means that we're going to get to know the annotation sections. Ooh, do we have them? This might be very interesting. Okay, you should. Oh, so if in view options, when when you see the screen, you see that Jihan has got a moving thing. You can click annotate, and if you pick text or drawing, you can draw lines or shapes. There is a stamp feature, and there are ways to make colors and things like that. So what we are asking you to do, and now I've got to find my screen that tells me what that is. So excuse me while I go find it again. We're asking you on this whiteboard all at once, in whatever way you would like to express yourself. We are asking you to make to express a commitment you can make to be a bridge. So whether that is a statement, a picture, a story, Jihan is going to kind of keep moving the whiteboard so everybody still has white space to fill. And if you, if that is a real challenge, you can get the stamping and you can kind of indicate the ones that others share that you agree with or that you think are possible or kind of solutions that you're going to want to try. So this is, we're making a commitment, one commitment of a way that we can be a bridge when we encounter individuals and groups that maybe typically we have a breaking habit with. We're going to intentionally lean into bridging behavior. Is that clear? Looks like people, okay, we've got annotate, many options. Pick your favorites.
And some of you are doing a great job of writing on the whiteboard and drawing. I love this. And we'll go ahead and save this as a PDF and send it on so that it can be shared in case you all want to have a copy of it. But as you all are doing so and finishing up reflecting, I want to share a prayer from the Book of Common Worship, Daily Prayer Edition. And it's an adaptation of the prayer for the human family as we continue thinking about how we might bridge and build kingdom of the vision that God has for all of us. Oh God, you made us in your own image and redeemed us through Jesus, your Son. Look with compassion on the whole human family. Look with compassion upon us. Take away the arrogance and hatred and the assumptions and the automatic associations that infect our hearts. Break down the walls that separate us. Unite us in bonds of love. Help us to create those bonds and bridges that create a bigger we. And through our struggle and confusion, work to accomplish your purposes on earth, that in your good time, all nations and peoples may live in harmony. that we might, as your church, continue to be about building a bigger we. Through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen. Thank you all for this time together.
And on behalf of the presbytery, I want to thank both of you, Molly and Jihan, for taking time to be with us today and for your insight and wisdom that you've shared with us here. And thank you, the rest of you, for joining us today. And I would like to close us in prayer for today. Gracious God, pour out your spirit of power and truth upon the whole church, that we may be for you a holy people, baptized to serve you in the world. Sustain your church and ministry, ground us in the gospel, secure our hope in Christ, strengthen our service to our neighbors, and increase our love for one another. In the name of Jesus Christ, our risen Lord. Amen.